I'll never forget the winter I lost my friend Jared in that blizzard. It was early January, and we had decided to head up into the mountains for a quick weekend hike. We'd been planning this trip for months, so we were excited. We figured it would be a good break from the routine, get out into nature, enjoy some peace and quiet, and catch up. The forecast didn't mention anything about a blizzard, but I guess that's how these things go sometimes. Weather's unpredictable in the mountains. We had already reached our halfway point when the first snowflakes started falling. We didn't think much of it at first. It was light, the kind of snow that you could easily walk through. But then it started coming down harder, and the wind picked up. We tried to turn back, but by then the storm had really picked up. Snow was falling so thick you couldn't see more than a few feet in front of you. The trail had disappeared, and we were stumbling around, trying to find our way. Jared was ahead of me by a little, and I remember calling out to him, but the wind was howling so loud that I don't even know if he heard me. I lost track of him. I thought maybe he had just gone ahead to find shelter or get to the cabin faster, but I couldn't catch up. I kept pushing through the storm, but after what felt like hours, I realized something was wrong. I wasn't hearing Jared's footsteps anymore. No crunching in the snow. No calling out. It was just me in the storm. I spent the next few hours looking for him. My phone had no signal, and it was getting colder by the minute. I don't know how long I searched, but it felt like an eternity. By the time I finally made it back to the cabin, the snow was up to my knees, and the wind had turned into something vicious. I tried to call out for him when I got back to the cabin, but no answer. I called his name over and over. Nothing. I figured he must have gotten back earlier, that he was waiting inside. But when I opened the door and stepped in, the place was empty. I knew something wasn't right. That's when I noticed the clue I'd missed earlier. On the ground near the doorway was Jared's backpack. It was right there, lying in the snow. He wouldn't have left it behind unless something had happened. I went outside again, thinking maybe he'd try to walk back to town or somewhere nearby, but it was too late. I couldn't find anything. No tracks, no signs of him. It was as if the snow had swallowed him whole. The storm raged on for hours, and I had to wait until morning to get help. When I finally did, we found nothing. No signs, no tracks. Just the same empty stretch of snow and trees. We spent days searching, but it was like Jared had vanished into thin air. The snow had covered any trace of him, and it felt like the storm itself had erased him from existence. The weirdest thing, though, was when we checked his backpack. Inside was a small piece of paper, just a scrap really. The handwriting was faint, but it was unmistakable. It was Jared's writing. It said, "Help me." It's not what it seems, but no one knew what he meant by that. And I still don't know. Even now, months later, I can't stop thinking about what happened that day. It doesn't make sense. How could someone just vanish like that in a storm? People disappear in the wilderness all the time, sure, but they usually leave something behind. Tracks, signs of struggle, something. But Jared? Nothing. Just a strange note in his bag. I haven't been back to those mountains since, and I don't think I ever will. It was the strangest thing. I can still remember the details so clearly, and yet when I try to tell people what happened, they just look at me like I've lost my mind. I don't blame them. If I hadn't been there myself, I wouldn't believe it either. But it's true. I saw it with my own eyes. It all started that December. I had just moved to a small town in the mountains. You know, one of those places where everyone knows everyone, and the winters are so harsh that people pretty much hibernate for months. I wasn't used to the cold, but I liked the peace. It was a fresh start after everything had fallen apart back home. One day, a heavy snowstorm rolled in. It wasn't unusual, but it was strong. The weather service had warned us that it was going to be bad, so most people stayed indoors. I wasn't one for sitting still though, so I decided to take a walk around town. I thought I'd get some fresh air and maybe clear my mind a little. I bundled up, grabbed my camera, and headed out. The storm was already starting to pick up by the time I left my house, but I wasn't worried. I'd seen worse. What I didn't realize was that this storm wasn't like the others. The snow started falling in sheets, blinding white, and the wind hit like ice shards. I had to squint just to see ahead of me. The usual quiet of the town was replaced with an eerie, oppressive silence. It was strange, but I didn't think much of it. I had always liked walking through the snow, especially when it was falling heavily. There's something almost peaceful about it, even though the wind cuts through your skin like knives. But that day I felt different. Something was off. The air was thick, and the weight of it seemed to push down on my chest. I should have turned around, but for some reason I kept walking. I made my way to the edge of town, where the woods began. The forest was quiet, too quiet, and I could barely see the trail anymore. The storm had completely blanketed everything, and the trees loomed like dark giants in the white chaos. That's when I saw her. At first I thought she was just another hiker. She was standing by the edge of the woods, just barely visible through the falling snow. She was wearing a long red coat, and her hair, long and dark, was flying out behind her in the wind. I don't know why I noticed her. Maybe it was the way she stood so still, almost frozen, or maybe it was just the oddity of seeing someone else out in such a storm. But I had a bad feeling. I called out to her, but the wind swallowed my words. Still, I kept walking toward her, my curiosity getting the best of me. I thought she might need help, or maybe she was lost like me. But when I got close enough, she was gone. There was no sign of her anywhere, not even footprints in the snow. I stopped in my tracks, confused. It didn't make sense. The snow was falling fast, but it wasn't like the storm could erase tracks that quickly. And she couldn't have disappeared that fast, not in that weather. I called out again, but this time the words barely left my mouth before I was sure I heard something. It was a soft, distant voice, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sent a chill down my spine. I stood there for a moment, straining my ears, but all I could hear was the howling wind. I should have left. I should have turned back and gone home, but something about that whisper. I couldn't shake it. I had to find out what was going on. So I took a step forward, then another, deeper into the woods. That was when I saw it, the cabin. I didn't know it was there before. I had walked this way countless times and I would have noticed it, but somehow I hadn't. It was small and decrepit, barely visible through the snow. But there it was, standing alone in the woods like it had been waiting for me. I approached cautiously. The air felt colder here, and the snow seemed to fall heavier, almost thick like smoke. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar, and the wind was rattling it in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I hesitated. I'd grown up in a place where you didn't go into strange cabins in the woods, but curiosity got the best of me. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped even more. It was like stepping into a freezer. The air was stale, and the silence was absolute. I couldn't hear the storm outside anymore. All I could hear was the thudding of my own heart. I looked around. There wasn't much inside, just an old wood stove, a few broken chairs, and dust covering everything. But there, on the floor, was something I didn't expect, a trail of footprints, leading from the door to the far corner of the room. But they weren't normal footprints. They were smaller, as if someone had been walking in bare feet, and they were leading nowhere. The trail just stopped. That's when the voice came again. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I froze. The air felt thick, and the silence pressed down on me like a weight. I turned around, ready to leave, but the door had slammed shut. I couldn't get it open. I tried, pulling and pushing with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. My breath started coming out in sharp gasps, and I could feel panic rising in my chest. That's when I saw her again, this time standing in the corner, her red coat glowing faintly in the dark. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. She was staring at me, her eyes wide and unblinking, and her lips moving as if she was trying to speak, but no sound came out. The whispering was growing louder now, like a chant. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually I found myself outside again, running back to town as fast as my legs could carry me. I didn't stop until I was inside my house, locking the door behind me. The storm lasted for 2 more days, and when it finally cleared, I went back to the woods, but the cabin was gone. The trees were still there, and the snow was still deep, but the cabin, along with whatever had been in it, had vanished. There was no trace of it anywhere. And that's when I knew. I knew that there was something in those mountains, something older than the snow itself, something that takes people in the storm and leaves only whispers behind. I never went back, and I'm pretty sure I never will. This isn't something I usually talk about, but it's been bothering me for years. I still don't have answers, but maybe writing it all down will help me make sense of it, or maybe someone out there will know what really happened. It started a few winters ago. My friend Sarah and I had been planning to visit a cabin in the mountains for a weekend getaway. We were looking for a break from the stress of work and life in general. I'd never been to this part of the state, but Sarah had visited a few times. She swore it was the perfect spot to unwind. The weather was turning cold as we packed up and set off for the cabin on a Friday afternoon. It wasn't exactly snowing when we left, but the forecast predicted a snowstorm later that evening. We figured we'd get there before the real bad weather hit. I remember feeling a little nervous about the trip, though something about the idea of being out in the mountains, cut off from civilization, just didn't sit right with me. But Sarah was adamant that it would be an adventure, so I went along with it. The cabin was about 2 hours away, nestled in the woods at the base of a mountain. When we arrived, the place looked charming enough, though remote. It was small but cozy, with large windows that framed the snowy landscape outside. The atmosphere was peaceful but eerie at the same time, especially as the sun began to set. We spent the evening inside, huddling by the fireplace, enjoying the warmth and the quiet. By the time we finished dinner and settled in with a movie, the storm had already started picking up outside. It was one of those blizzards where you can hear the wind howling against the walls, and the snow piles up so fast you can't see a few feet ahead of you. We weren't too concerned at first. Sarah made jokes about how it was perfect weather for a horror movie marathon, and I laughed along. But as the night went on, I started feeling uncomfortable. Something about the isolation of the cabin started to get to me. It wasn't just the storm, it was a strange feeling in the air, like the world outside had gone completely still. The sound of the wind was so intense, it drowned out everything else. There was no wildlife, no rustling trees, no sounds of the outside world at all. It felt unnatural. I decided to go for a quick walk around the cabin, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. Sarah didn't want to come with me, she was already half asleep on the couch, so I grabbed my coat and stepped outside into the snow. The snow was falling in heavy sheets now, but I could still make out the faint outline of the trees around the cabin. As I walked around the property, I noticed something strange, a set of footprints in the snow, leading away from the cabin. I was confused at first. I knew we hadn't gone out there recently, and it didn't seem like anyone else had arrived. Still, I decided to follow them, thinking maybe someone had passed by earlier. The tracks were fresh, but as I followed them deeper into the woods, the snow seemed to get heavier. It was hard to see much of anything, and my thoughts began to wander. That's when I heard a faint cry for help. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again, clearer this time, like someone was calling my name. My heart raced as I scanned the woods, but I saw nothing. I immediately turned around and headed back toward the cabin, but as I walked, I started to realize just how far I had gotten from the house. The snow was now so thick I couldn't see anything beyond a few feet in front of me. Panic set in. I tried to call out for Sarah, but my voice was lost in the wind. The storm was so loud it swallowed everything. My steps grew heavier as the snow piled up around me, and it was starting to feel like the woods were closing in. By the time I made it back to the cabin, my breath was short, and my clothes were covered in snow. I burst through the door, calling for Sarah, but there was no answer. The lights were still on, the fire still crackling, but Sarah was gone. I checked every room in the cabin, even the small bathroom, but she wasn't anywhere. It didn't make sense. She hadn't left the cabin. She couldn't have, not in this storm. I grabbed my phone to call her, but there was no signal. I started to panic. The wind was howling louder outside, and the storm was becoming a full-blown blizzard. It felt like the world outside was swallowing up the cabin, and the silence inside was suffocating. Hours went by, but there was no sign of Sarah. I tried everything calling her phone, searching the property again, but it was all in vain. It was like she had just vanished into thin air. By morning, the storm was finally letting up. I couldn't understand what had happened. I had searched the cabin thoroughly, checked all the doors, and even looked around outside for signs of her. Nothing. I called the authorities as soon as I could, but they didn't have any answers. They couldn't find any trace of Sarah, and when they investigated the snow outside, the only footprints they found were mine. It was as though she had simply disappeared. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that there was something I was missing, something I wasn't seeing. It didn't add up. How could someone just vanish like that? I still don't know what happened to Sarah. Was it the storm? Something else in the woods? Or was it something more? The way the woods felt, the silence, the strange sense of being watched, it was like something had taken her. To this day, I don't go near those mountains, and I still can't explain what happened. No one ever found Sarah. No one ever found any clues as to where she went or why she disappeared. She just vanished, as if the blizzard swallowed her whole. And sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can still hear her calling out for help in the wind. If anyone reading this has had a similar experience, please reach out. I'm not sure what happened that night, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Maybe the storm didn't just take Sarah, it took something else too. I've been sitting on this story for years. It's not something I like to talk about, but every winter I can't help but think about that blizzard and what happened to Kyle. I don't know if I'll ever have all the answers, but maybe sharing this will help me make sense of it. It all started back in 2014. My best friend Kyle and I decided to spend the weekend at his family's cabin in the Adirondacks. It was a last-minute thing, but we'd been talking about getting away for a while. The weather was starting to turn cold, and it felt like the perfect time to escape the city and get some peace in the mountains. The cabin was isolated, the kind of place you can only get to by driving down narrow, winding roads that no one else knows about. The sort of place where you're cut off from everything and everyone. When we first arrived that Friday afternoon, the weather seemed fine. The snow was light and gentle, just enough to make it feel like winter without any real threat. Kyle had been up there before, but it was my first time. It was a bit eerie, but in a good way. The silence of the place was so deep, like the mountains swallowed every sound. The air felt crisp and clean, and I thought I could hear the snowflakes hitting the ground, though it was probably just my imagination. We unloaded the car, got the fire going, and settled in. That night we drank beers and talked about everything old high school memories, current life struggles, and plans for the future. I'll admit, I felt relaxed for the first time in a while. It was the kind of getaway you need when the world starts to feel too loud. But as we went to bed that night, the storm started to pick up. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the cabin. The snow came down harder, and by morning it was a full-blown blizzard. I remember looking out the window and seeing nothing but white. The snow was coming down so fast you couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the cabin. We had planned on doing a little hiking the next day, but the storm was so intense, we knew it was better to stay inside. So we spent the day inside, reading and playing cards, trying to pass the time. Around noon, Kyle suggested we go for a walk in the snow, just to get out of the cabin and stretch our legs. He had this idea that the storm would clear up a bit, and I guess I didn't think much of it. But I wasn't sure it was getting worse outside, and the winds had picked up to the point where the trees were bending under the pressure. Reluctantly, I agreed. I didn't want to be the boring one, especially since Kyle was so eager. He insisted it would be a short walk just up to a ridge he had been to before. It seemed harmless enough, so I put on my boots and coat, and we headed out. The snow was already knee-deep, and the trail we were supposed to follow was barely visible. We were basically walking blind, guided only by the few landmarks Kyle remembered from his previous trips. As we walked, I started to realize how quickly things were getting worse. The storm was picking up intensity, and the wind was freezing. It wasn't long before we were struggling to keep our balance. We could barely see where we were stepping, and I started to get worried. We had passed the point where the ridge should have been, but Kyle kept insisting we were close. The snow was coming down so hard, we couldn't even hear each other over the wind. At one point I lost sight of Kyle. I didn't know how it happened. 1 second he was in front of me, and the next I was standing there alone. I called out to him, but the wind drowned out my voice. Panic set in. I started looking around, but everything was white, just endless snow. It felt like the storm was swallowing up the whole world. I started walking in the direction I thought we had come from, but the wind had completely erased our footprints. I had no idea which way I was going. The snow was coming down in thick sheets now, and it was impossible to see anything. I kept walking, trying to remember how far we had come. The snow was sticking to my face, and my hands were going numb from the cold. I was about to turn back and head in a different direction when I saw something in the snow footprints. But they didn't look like mine. They were smaller, more delicate, like someone else had walked through the snow. I felt a jolt of fear. Had Kyle come back and passed by me without me noticing? I followed the tracks, hoping it was him. But the further I went, the stranger the footprints became. They didn't follow a straight path, but twisted and turned like someone had been walking in circles. I started to feel like I was being drawn into something I didn't understand, but I couldn't stop myself. My body moved on its own, pushing me forward through the snowdrifts. Eventually I stopped. The footprints led me to the base of a tree, and that's when I noticed something else. Kyle's jacket, folded neatly on the ground. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't normal. I had been looking for him, but I never expected to find his jacket like this, out in the snow, as though it had been discarded. The weight in my chest grew heavier, and I immediately knew something was wrong. I picked up the jacket and scanned the area around me. There was no sign of Kyle. No more footprints, no trail, nothing. I felt the air shift as if something had changed. I knew I had to get back to the cabin and call for help. I don't know how long it took, but I eventually made it back to the cabin. When I burst through the door, I was out of breath and shivering uncontrollably. I didn't know how to explain what had happened. I told the authorities about the jacket and the tracks, but they never found Kyle. They said it was likely the storm that had taken him. They searched the area for days, but it was as if the storm had erased all traces of him. The blizzard had claimed him, they said. Years have passed, but I still don't understand it. I've tried to put it behind me, but I can't shake the image of those strange footprints, leading to nothing. I've been back to the cabin since that day, but I can't bring myself to go near the woods again. It feels like the storm is still there, waiting. What happened to Kyle? Was it the storm? Was there something else out there? Maybe the blizzard didn't just take him, it took something more. Something that can never be explained. If anyone reading this has experienced something similar, please let me know. I'm still trying to make sense of it. Kyle was never found, and I'll never know if he walked into that blizzard willingly or if something else led him out there. There was something.